Tonight on Ukraine Today, a dead-end peace process, how Russia sabotages peace efforts and what real influence Trump has over Putin. Stability with Russia, what else the updated US national security strategy includes. The battlefield situation, urban fighting in Pokrovsk, Russian advances in Zaporizhzhia, shelling and Ukraine's response. A frightening forecast for Russia, why 2026 may become a year of Islamist terror inside the country. All that and more, right now. Hello, I'm Volodymyr Robchun and this is Ukraine Today. Please subscribe, hit the like button and let's move to the news. Let's start with the front line. In the Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces are clearing the urban area from Russian troops. Over the past day, on the Pokrovsk axis, our defense forces stopped 45 Russian assaults, eliminated more than 80 invaders, destroyed 7 vehicles and special-purpose units, and struck 12 enemy shelters. Meanwhile, Putin's army pushed forward in the Zaporizhzhia region. In total, over the last day, Russia lost at least 810 occupiers, killed and wounded. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, that makes 1,181,680 Russian troops eliminated. In the past 24 hours alone, Ukraine destroyed 2 Russian tanks, 1 armored fighting vehicle, 10 artillery systems, and dozens of other pieces of enemy equipment. More on the situation at the front in our story.
Along the front line, which stretches for more than 1,250 kilometers, over 710,000 Russian occupiers have been deployed. Despite the enemy army's impressive numbers, Ukraine's defense forces have advanced in 4 directions, while the Russians have only advanced in 1.
Putin has repeatedly claimed that these places have been captured. Pokrovsk, Mironohrad, Kostiantynivka, not to mention others, all of them. Kupiansk, especially there. They raised their flag several times, and even Putin himself, not just being briefed but personally, announced that the city had been captured just like Vovchansk. In other words, he needs to demonstrate the actual capture of territory and show us that offensive operations will continue. And if we don't accept his terms, if we don't give up, especially if we don't finally surrender Donetsk region, he will accordingly continue to develop offensive operations in the winter, intensifying them. He increases pressure on the front and steps up pressure on the rear, on ordinary civilians on the energy sector, so that people freeze in winter to sow panic and doubt. And in these few months, he aims to actually achieve his goals. The first stage involves a ceasefire on his terms and the signing of a peace agreement, and then preparations for possible new operations.
The Russians struck the dam of the Pechenihi reservoir in the Kharkiv region. Traffic on the roadway has been halted. The American Institute for the Study of War does not confirm the Russians' claims of success. In the southern part of Vovchansk and in the Kupiansk district.
Reporting from the Vovchansk direction. Here it is. Manila.
One Russian war correspondent claimed that their troops advanced in the southern part of Vovchansk, while another said that the Russians had captured the village of Lyman and control 80% of Vovchansk. The occupiers are using the tactic of shading in areas they allegedly captured. In many cases, fighting is still ongoing in these areas, and it's too early to talk about them being captured.
This is a screen grab from the Creamy Whim project. It was recorded that events are taking place 500 meters deep into territory that they themselves had previously shaded as being under Russian control. In general, there are the most questions about the shading done by this particular project. For them, literally, the defeat of a lone Russian soldier by an FPV drone is a reason to shade in a couple of kilometers up to the place where it happened. But at the same time, it's important to remember that in today's reality, control is a very relative concept, especially in cities. Because while infiltration across open terrain is at least somewhat difficult, in urban neighborhoods it's a whole different story. It's easy to hide from drones, it's basically an open thoroughfare. So for now, all we can say is that fighting is taking place in the area that was previously shaded as Russian, which in itself isn't bad.
Russian forces have continued combat operations in the Zaporizhzhia region. In particular, the occupiers attacked near Huliaipol and Orikiv. However, there are no confirmed changes to the front line. Near
Huliaipol, the activity is unlikely to be any less today. Our assault unit is also operating here. You know that the Russians From time to time, they also spread fake reports claiming they've advanced somewhere. Obviously, these fake reports are primarily aimed at Ukrainian society in order to create a certain emotional atmosphere.
On November 21st, propaganda channels released a video showing soldiers holding the Russian Federation flag in the Oleksandrivka direction and claiming the occupation of Tike and Otradne. Ukrainian soldiers have liberated the village of Tike in the Sinelnikova district of Dnipropetrovsk region from the occupiers. There is video evidence to confirm this. Ukrainian warriors continue to defend Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. In a video published on December 6th, 3 Ukrainian soldiers raised the flag on Yakub Kolas Lane in the northern part of the city, which indicates Paihimi Mats, holding positions. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine called this stage of the defense extremely difficult.
Our strategy is to exhaust the Russian army as much as possible, to prevent its advance, to hold our territory simultaneously, striking the enemy in the rear, in operational depth, and even on Russian territory itself, with the aim of undermining its defensive potential and industrial capabilities.
General Oleksandr Syrsky also stated in an interview that Ukrainian forces are holding their positions in the north of Pokrovsk.
The Ukrainian army is conducting a strategic defensive operation aimed at restraining the enemy's advance, preventing its breakthrough deeper, inflicting maximum losses, and carrying out counteroffensive actions in those sectors where we see the enemy's vulnerabilities. At
the same time, the Russians have managed to significantly complicate Ukrainian logistics in the Pokrovsk direction. The occupiers' goal is to completely cut off Ukrainian supply and evacuation routes. However, they have still not managed to encircle the Ukrainian garrisons in either city. This is also confirmed by the American Institute for the Study of War.
Ukrainian forces are maintaining limited logistics on the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad axis, but Russian troops are very likely able to disrupt Ukrainian evacuation routes and ground lines of communication using artillery and drones.
The defense forces are trying to organize additional logistical routes to supply their units. Throughout the week, the main focus was the north of Donetsk region. It was to that area that the Russians were transferring manpower. The transfers were carried out in convoys accompanied by military police.
The dominant direction this week was the north of Donetsk region. From the Berdyansk direction, through the city of Mariupol toward Volnovakha, between 10 and 20 trucks were observed daily, mostly carrying personnel and without tactical markings. This indicates the arrival of new units after training and matches the training schedule. Despite
the heavy losses, the pace of the Russian Federation's offensive is increasing. At the same time, Russia continues to intensify its strikes on Ukrainian cities.
Russian forces struck the dam of the Pechenigi reservoir in the Kharkiv region. Traffic across the dam has been stopped. The armed forces said that even if the structure were damaged further, it would not affect their abilities to fight. Invaders attacked a 9-story residential building in Ochtyrka, Sumy region, using FPV drones. A fire broke out. Rescuers evacuated 35 residents. Another 7 people, including 1 child, were freed from damaged apartments. Overnight, the enemy also attacked civilians in Chernihiv. A residential area in the city center was hit. 3 people were injured. A multi-story building, a kindergarten, shops and cars were damaged. For the 3rd night in a row, Russia attacked the town of Fastiv in the Kyiv region. Several rooftops caught fire. The blast wave damaged a private house and administrative buildings. And now the grim numbers, because this is not just statistics. These are lives taken, families shattered, homes destroyed. Throughout the past week alone, Russia used more than 1,600 attack drones, about 1,200 glide bombs and nearly 70 missiles of various types against peaceful Ukrainian cities and towns. These are the peaceful intentions of Russia and Putin. Meanwhile, US Presidential Envoy General Kit Kellogg says a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia is in the final stretch. According to him, unsolved issues remain around the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, part of the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions, and the situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. With all respect to General Kellogg, and he truly deserves respect, one question rises. What issues have been resolved then? Crimea, the size of Ukraine's armed forces, Ukraine NATO status? Because it looks like the questions about Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant are no less important. If these are unresolved, then nothing is resolved at all. So I dare to say the progress is tiny, if it exists at all. At the same time, the United States published an updated national security strategy. This document outlines the main foreign policy priorities of the current administration. It notes in particular the need to restore strategic stability in relations with Russia. Details next.
Trump is abandoning, or rather dumping, Europe. Washington no longer wants to be the main guarantor of the EU's security. According to Western media, the Trump administration has told European allies in closed-door meetings that after 2027, the US will no longer be the main force in NATO. Responsibility for the alliance's defense will supposedly fall solely on Europe's own shoulders.
This event marks a dramatic shift that puts Europe on a strict countdown, given the raging war in Ukraine and the uncertainty surrounding transatlantic security.
However, despite all the alarmism for European leaders, such behavior from the White House administration did not come as a surprise. The Pentagon had already warned that it plans to reduce its role in NATO's defense. Now, however, it sounded like a tough ultimatum.
But in essence, he is stepping back from NATO, then narrowing his focus and concentrating on changing the mainstream centrist forces in Europe, declaring that the United States will play a more active role in influencing such changes.
However, the Trump administration does not plan to reduce the number of American troops in Europe.
The United States is and remains our most important ally in the alliance. However, the NATO bloc is focused on addressing political and security issues.
In fact, the ultimatum presented to the member countries actually works in their favor. In reality, the Pentagon will only reduce the number of high-ranking American officers in NATO's command structure. Some of these positions will be transferred to Europeans. And Donald Trump also wants the EU to start buying weapons from the US.
Among the winners in terms of time, resources and attention are the Western Hemisphere and possibly the Pacific region. Sorry, but among the losers is Europe. It comes out at a loss. This administration is essentially saying good luck to all of you.
But there's no need to worry. Unlike Europe, Ukraine will always have all the necessary weapons and support from Trump. Despite the strategic shift, American officials swear by it. Weapons deliveries to Kyiv are not being suspended, and a significant increase is even expected by Christmas.
A list of Ukraine's priority needs. The Ukrainian side submits a request for what is most urgently needed right now, and purchases are being made accordingly.
It seems Trump has finally given up on the idea of persuading Putin. So, on the eve of 2026, the American president has decided to move on to Plan B, the famous peace through strength.
Russia is ramping up the intensity of its hybrid attacks, but the Kremlin thug only understands the language of force. Only that. That's why any attempts to negotiate after yet another aggressive scenario from Russia, like this one, for example, will be seen by Putin as weakness, as Europe's weakness, and he will push even harder.
However, no matter how hard Putin pressures Europe, he himself is under even greater pressure.
This war has been going on for 4 years already, and over 1 million lives have been lost there. They will never conquer Ukraine. And as for resources, well, just look at what Nabiulina is saying. Just a week ago, she said, we need to fight not for money anymore, but for patriotism. Yes, all the regions, the ones sending people to fight, used to receive, well, large sums of money. And besides the fact that the military-industrial complex there is working around the clock, and in addition, they pay big money, people are fighting on the front lines, but it's not a bottomless barrel.
Meanwhile, analysts assure that Ukraine will continue to receive military aid from the US and our European partners.
And judging by the position of Donald Trump himself, even if he says this is not my war and I will not take part in it, he is still profiting from this war, and he will continue to profit. And he will sell these weapons to the Europeans, and the Europeans will pay for them and supply these weapons to you.
And no matter how many loud statements are made in the White House regarding NATO, it will not affect Ukraine in any way. After all, Trump needs us to create his ideal image as a peacemaker much more than it might seem. At the same time as the strikes deeper into Russia become more regular, support for the American president himself is also growing.
Donald Trump has no other options. Either he must distance himself, but he won't be able to because in America there are midterm elections in a year. In America, public opinion largely supports Ukraine, including among his own supporters. That's why he will have to maneuver. He will no longer be as categorical as we heard at the very beginning of his term.
Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become a sponsor. And please subscribe to the channel, like this video and share it. 1 minute of your time really helps the channel grow. Thank you and glory to Ukraine. A Russian victory in the war against Ukraine would be a defeat for the entire West. That's what Czech President Petr Pavel said in an interview with the Sunday Times. He added that talk about secret negotiations between the US and Russia, especially about handing over Ukrainian territories, dangerously resembles the Munich Agreement of 1938. Back then, European countries allowed the annexation of Czechoslovakia to avoid greater aggression. As we know, it only fueled Nazi Germany's appetite and led to the start of World War II. This week, Ukraine's representatives will hold a series of meetings with allies. The main topic: peace efforts. President Volodymyr Zelensky will meet European leaders in London and also in Brussels.
Ukraine deserves a just peace. And this peace really depends on Russia, on our joint pressure on Russia, and on the right negotiating positions of the United States, Europe and all our other partners. Russia must be held accountable for what it does, for the daily strikes, for the constant terror against our people, and overall, for this war.
But Ukraine relies not only on partners, but also on its own strength, especially Ukrainian weapons. The Ukrainian company Firepoint showed its production facilities. This is the developer and manufacturer of the Flamingo missile with a range of up to 3,000 kilometers.
A Ukrainian defense technology company is changing the face of war. For the first time, Firepoint has revealed unique footage of its drone and missile production. Over the past year, the company has achieved impressive results both in manufacturing and in the effectiveness of its products. These drones are 3 times cheaper than their competitors on the drone market used for medium-range strikes. According to published statistics, Firepoint's combat systems are leading in the use of heavy combat drones. More than half of all uses of long-range drones with a warhead of over 30 kilograms are Firepoint systems. Firepoint drones have distinguished themselves by striking critically important enemy targets, including ammunition depots, arsenals in Toropets and Tikhoretsk, several airfields, Taganrog, Marinovka, Engels 2, Shaikovka, an airbase, S-400 air defense system positions, as well as, for example, in Sontsevka, Donetsk region, the command post of the 90th Tank Division of the Russian Federation. From time to time, there are also truly exclusive catches, such as military helicopters. The activities of the Ukrainian company Firepoint are aimed at providing Ukraine with the capability to deliver just retaliatory strikes on Russian territory. Back when all of this was starting, when people said we were fighting with one hand tied behind our back, I tend to agree with your opinion that this is the correct interpretation of what was happening at the time. But now we have our own production, and it is precisely our domestic manufacturing that has given us the ability to use our forces and resources as we see fit. The Kremlin understands only the language of force. The best argument in any negotiations with Moscow is a powerful Ukrainian army and defense industry, particularly the domestic production of long-range drones and missiles, with which Ukraine can regularly strike targets in Russia located 1,000 or more kilometers from the front line.
In order to somehow bring this ongoing war to a complete stalemate, yes, we absolutely need to learn not only to effectively repel all enemy attacks on the crucial front line, but also to decisively suppress their vital logistics and their powerful aviation capabilities. And of course, I'm not even mentioning the necessity of striking enterprises of Russia's military-industrial complex and its energy system.
For dessert, Ukrainian engineers have prepared the Flamingo cruise missile for the Russian occupiers. This Ukrainian pink bird, in addition to its impressive range of 3,000 kilometers, boasts a warhead weighing over 1,000 kilograms.
Usually the warhead of a modern cruise missile is about 450, well at most 500 kilograms. As a rule, almost all missiles have a warhead of 450 kilograms. What does a one-ton warhead provide? If it hits a target, for example, an industrial facility, 2 such missiles will completely disable it for at least a year. That is, there will be a single crater about 20 meters in diameter.
Russian terrorists who are shelling Ukrainian cities must understand a mirrored strike will inevitably happen.
Russia's so-called authorities put the commander of Ukraine's drone systems forces, Robert Brody, call sign Matyar, on an international wanted list. Brody published data from Russian propaganda sources claiming he was charged in absentia of the death of a first-channel correspondent, allegedly in the Kursk region. Given that Russia no longer has independent media, we are clearly talking about propagandists, regime supporters, not journalists. Moreover, Russia often hits its own territory, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident. So I wouldn't rule out that the Kremlin itself is behind the death of that propagandist, if the story isn't made up altogether. Finally, a threatening forecast for Russia. 2026 may become a year of Islamist terror inside the country. This warning comes from within the FSB itself. Russian security services report a sharp rise in internal threats. Moscow and other major cities are in high-risk zone. More details ahead.
These are the scenes that are now being actively broadcast on Russian television. They show FSB officers detaining a cell of international terrorists in Bashkiria who were spreading the idea of creating a global caliphate. The 8 detainees preached the ideology of a terrorist organization banned in Russia among Muslims and during underground meetings recruited others into their ranks. But lately, materials like these are becoming more and more common on Russian TV. And the key points in them are that the FSB has reported an increase in the threat of terrorist attacks inside the country.
From time to time in Russia, a target for anger is created. For the most part, it's always some kind of external force. But sometimes there's a need to start stirring up the situation.
Russian security services are recording a rise in Islamic terrorism in Russia. According to media reports, such a report was received by the head of the FSB, Alexander Bortnikov, but has not yet been passed on to the Russian dictator Putin. However, according to other sources, the document may in fact have already ended up on Putin's desk. And interestingly, among the key threats is also the increased activity of certain sabotage groups within the country that is far from the so-called special military operation zone, including in the capital itself, Moscow. And another important point is the threat of destabilization in the Caucasus.
Actions that demonstrated the strength of the state, that there are enemies and they will deal with them. This is the strong Putin and yet more enemies who want to attack the besieged fortress.
And here we return to the previously mentioned information about the arrests in Bashkiria, where, according to the FSB, they managed to catch 8 members of a terrorist organization. At that time, it was also reported that the group was preparing active operations on Russian territory. The sources who provided this information to the media agree that in 2026, the situation could get worse if the FSB and other agencies do not make this area a priority. But here it's important to remember that such messages are not just shared in Russia for no reason. These are well-planned provocations. Such terrorist attacks can indeed be organized by Russian special services, since this serves both domestic and foreign audiences. For Russians themselves, it's simply about destabilizing the situation.
These statements will definitely be followed by terrorist attacks there will definitely be, or more accurately, most likely, people who are detained or killed who will have certain documents or affiliations with one terrorist organization or another, or some kind of national background. And this will be sold to the public internally. That's how Russians have always been frightened.
We all remember well the terrorist attack at Crocus, which Putin used to accuse the so-called neo-Nazi Kiev regime.
On the coordinator's orders, after committing the crime, the terrorists drove toward the Russian-Ukrainian border in a car, intending to then reach Kyiv to receive the reward they had been promised.
There's quite a C-complex narrative there. As far as I understand, there were initial reports from the FSB and from FSB-affiliated Telegram channels that there was supposedly a stash where weapons were kept, which had been prepared for these 4 people so that they could take these weapons. That's the idea, as far as I understand. And then with it, they were supposed to break through towards Ukraine. So far, we haven't seen any evidence that this stash actually exists.
In the end, this tragedy became a tool for mobilizing society and a push for a new wave of signing volunteer contracts with the Russian Ministry of Death. But for the wider public, creating a fake isn't that easy. First of all, because it would have to be linked to Ukraine again. And that's exactly what's critically important for the Kremlin right now.
If this is used in the Ukraine case, well, if they find, I don't know, Budanov's business card again, for example, right? Then it won't be sold domestically. Most likely it will be sold abroad. And the United States, look, they're not playing by the rules of war.
Other experts are saying the same thing.
A whole series of activities by the FSB is preparation for terrorist attacks both in Russia and in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the goal is to demoralize society amid scandals, power outages, and the situation at the front. In Russia, it's to stir up the population in order to justify a new wave of mobilization.
Simply put, the Russian ruling regime is quite capable of orchestrating a series of terrorist attacks within the country itself, then blaming everything on Ukraine and using this either to gain leverage in negotiations or to completely intimidate Russians and drive them into total mobilization.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share. See you next time.